All right, good morning, boys and girls. It is time to read Walking with Miss Millie. We're going to do chapters 21 and 22 today. All right. I hope you guys had a great weekend. Let's get started. Chapter 21. Miss Millie sat at the picnic table, and beside her was Miss Frankie working her way through a plate of food. Mama would have said it was horrible manners to barge in when I saw Miss Millie had company, but I couldn't help myself. I stomped over to the picnic table that was full of enough chicken, potato salad, deviled eggs, and chips to feed a lot more than two ladies, and plopped myself down. I stomped over to the picnic table. Oh, I just said that. Just like that, I sat down like they were waiting for me, and it was about time I got there. Miss Millie looked over to me and tried to smile, but her smile didn't look too happy. "Glad you're here, Alice girl," she finally said. But I couldn't begin to talk just then, since I had more emotions swirling inside me than Miss Frankie had piles of food on her plate. And that was a lot. Miss Millie cleared her throat. "Miss Frankie, I reckon you remember Alice Ann here?" Miss Frankie nodded my way, and I was glad to see that she was too busy eating to want to chat now, which was fine with me. I was done talking to people, maybe forever. Miss Millie looked at Miss Frankie and moved her head up and down like she was waiting for something. Miss Frankie shrugged her shoulders. Then Miss Millie cleared her throat again, this time real dramatic-like, the way a person does when they really don't have something stuck in there, like they're just trying to get someone's attention. "Ahem," she said to Miss Frankie before she turned to me. "Alice girl, I think Miss Frankie owes you an apology." Miss Frankie snorted, stopped her chewing, and wiped her mouth. Finally, in an exaggerated, fancy voice, she said, "Miss Alice, I do so beg your pardon. When the phone rang a bit ago, I was in the house fetching a fork, 'cause some people don't know how to set a table. Well, I was fetching myself a fork when the phone rang, thinking it was for Millie, and being the thoughtful friend I am, knowing how much older she is than me, I grabbed the phone. I guess it wasn't for Miss Millie, though. It was for you, and it was your papa." So that was it. When Daddy was coughing up excuses, I thought I'd heard actual coughing that sounded like Miss Millie on the other end. So I guess this time it was Miss Frankie doing the listening in on my party line. Miss Millie, who I noticed still hadn't touched her plate, turned back to me. "I'm so sorry your daddy didn't come today. Do you want to go inside and talk? Or maybe we could take Clarence for a walk after dinner? Where is that dog? I can't believe he's not in here begging for food." Before I could answer, we were interrupted by a boy standing at the open side gate yelling, "I think he belongs to you, don't he?" I don't know if I was more surprised that the boy who was doing the yelling was none other than the younger McHale brother, or that the he was referring to was Clarence. Clarence, who wasn't moving at all. "What'd you do to him?" I shouted as I ran over to them. I wanted to smack that McHale boy. But Clarence took up the entire length of his arms, and I didn't want to accidentally hit the dog instead. So I started pumping my clenched fist in the air, pretending I was hitting that boy, or maybe even Daddy, Mama, and everybody in Rainbow too. Miss Millie, who I guess has had a lot more patience and practice dealing with the sadness and disappointment, raised herself from the picnic table and walked over to Clarence. "What happened to my dog, young man?" The McHale boy had the look of a lamb who accidentally wandered into a den full of foxes. I found him up the street, a car. It didn't stop." At that moment, I prayed to the God I hoped wasn't deaf at all. I prayed that Clarence wasn't dead. Hadn't Miss Millie lost enough in this world? The thought of that ornery little dog not running in circles anymore made my eyes start to water. And once you believe, right then and there, I knew God could hear just fine, since Clarence started to stir in the McHale boy's arms. His wrinkled eye peeked open as he let out a low, pathetic growl, like he was telling the McHale boy he wasn't as helpless as he looked. Miss Millie took Clarence in her arms, and he yelped. "Must have knocked him out, but he seems to be coming to." She moved to the table with all the food and scooted the fried chicken and deviled eggs to the side so she could lay down her little baby. Miss Frankie's eyes grew as big as those deviled eggs at the suggestion of her Independence Day feast being ruined, but even she knew not to interrupt Miss Millie right then. The rest of us stood back and watched as Miss Millie stroked the beat-up tan and white fur of her Clarence to look for injuries. His tiny circle eyes peeked out from his tan eye patch and watched her every move like he was saying, "It's okay, I trust you." I saw her lips moving, but I couldn't hear the words she was saying to him as she ever so gentle felt around his whole body. And when she got to his hind leg, he let out another yelp. I looked over at the McHale boy who stood there with his mouth wide open and his arms still reaching out like he still held Clarence. Miss Millie pulled out her handkerchief and wrapped it tight around Clarence's hind leg, knotting it with the skill of someone who had done such a thing before. When she was done, Clarence licked her hand like he was saying, "Thanks, that's better." Then he must have got a whiff of the feast laid out next to him because he turned his head like someone called his name, stood up on all but his hind leg, and started to eat a chicken leg. At the sight of the dog eating her feast, Miss Frankie let out a yelp like she had been hit by a car as well. To keep the peace, Miss Millie moved Clarence with both his sore leg and his chicken leg to the ground, and she turned to the McHale boy. "You got a first name, Mr. McHale?" Yes. "Well, do I have to guess what it is, or might you tell me?" Miss Millie winked at me as I remembered a similar first encounter with her. My name is Jake." "Well, Jake, I owe you for saving my dog. Thank you kindly." And with those words, she stretched out her hand to shake his, and in that moment, fear crept across his face as if he was staring at a poisonous snake about to strike and not the hand of an old lady. I've heard grown-ups talk about time standing still, and I never got it before. But right then in that moment, when Miss Millie held out her hand to Jake McHale, and he wasn't sure what to do with it, if time didn't stand completely still, at least it slowed down far more than a bit. Even Miss Frankie stopped slurping her food. And I swear Clarence paused from his bone to watch the goings-on. At the moment, time might have been remembering to go forward. Miss Millie might have been remembering just who was on the other end of her stretched hand. I was remembering what I heard about the McHale's daddy being mean and prejudiced, and Miss Frankie saying the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Right when Miss Millie might have been thinking all that too. And I saw the smile begin to leave her face as her hand began to lower. But right before her outstretched hand came to rest at her side, Jake McHale reached out his dirt-covered hand and grabbed Miss Millie's hand in his. "You're welcome," he managed to say as he pumped their hands up and down. The smile found its way back to Miss Millie's face, and when the handshake pumping was over, time got back to ticking away at regular speed. I guess Clarence ran off through the gate somebody left open. Miss Millie looked directly at Miss Frankie, who had resumed her consuming of the feast. "Whereabouts did you find him?" "Up by the church," Jake answered, not taking his eyes off Clarence. "He was kind of running in circles up the street when the car came by. They screeched their brakes but hit him hard enough so he couldn't move. Then the car up and left." "And you saved him and brought him back to me? Thank you." Miss Millie was trying to sound all conversational, but she was starting to sound more emotional at the suggestion of Clarence just lying in the street. A blush washed over Jake's freckles, blending them all into one patch of red splashed across his face. "Well, the least I can do is give you some food for your troubles," Miss Millie offered the boy, who gulped at the suggestion. From the looks of him, he didn't get a lot of offers to eat. And right then, on that holiday, standing beside Miss Millie's picnic table, I was looking at that skinny Jake McHale and thinking about Pam saying how mad their daddy got, and I started wondering what kind of a rough life they had. All he seemed to be doing was eyeing the feast on the picnic table, and he stammered, I couldn't. And he looked toward the front yard like he was looking for somebody or some reason. But whatever reasons his head had for saying no, his stomach seemed to overrule them, and his whole body just plain sat down and started eating a drumstick like it was the last drumstick on the planet. Miss Millie laughed and handed him a plate, and then she turned to me. "Alice girl, why don't you join us too?" I really wanted to, but I knew Mama would be looking for me soon to come to our own picnic. So I sat down and decided to nibble on a handful of potato chips. I was thinking that as I looked around at the picnic table, we sure made an interesting 4th of July party. But once everyone started eating, it all kind of seemed natural. But before I could reach for more chips, Miss Millie's picnic was interrupted once again, this time when someone yelled a word that would get my mouth washed out with soap even if I whispered it. We all turned to the front gate to see the older McHale brother who yelled, "What do you think you're doing sitting with those people? Eating their food. Wait until Pa hears about this." Jake turned pale and jumped up from the table so fast he fell. Picking himself up, he ran out of the backyard, not once looking back. After Jake and his brother left, we didn't feel like eating anymore, except Miss Frankie, of course. Chapter 22. I didn't feel like playing much the next day, but the house was just too hot to stay inside. On the tire swing in the shade of the tree, I could feel at least a little breeze blowing as I was swinging back and forth. Pam was over and playing checkers with Eddie, but even she seemed quieter than normal, which for Pam was huge. Swinging gentle in the tire, I tried to forget how mad I was at Daddy. I watched Pam and Eddie play their game. When Eddie won, Pam signed good. He, of course, signed thank you. Then I couldn't believe it, but I saw Pam finger spelling her name to him. Her hand shook way too much for good finger spelling, but Eddie didn't seem to mind, and he signed good over and over to her. I watched Eddie start driving again while Pam folded the checkerboard box back into the box. It didn't fit just right, and I saw her get madder at it until she finally just tossed the checkerboard to the ground. And that wasn't like Pam. I walked over to her. "Are you okay?" She looked embarrassed and said, "I'm fine, silly. I'm fine, fine." And wouldn't you know, that was one fine too many. And I saw Pam's bottom lip quiver before she began to cry something fierce. I have to go. Daddy was mad, and poor Jake, and..." She moved to get up, but it looked like her legs weren't letting her. Instead, she just cried more. I sank down next to her, and all I could think to do was pat the top of her head. It kind of looked like I was petting Clarence, and it must have felt the same for Pam, because she smiled through her tears and said, "I am not a dog, silly." I lowered my hand so it rested on her shoulder. "What's wrong with Jake?" I asked. "I mean, he did save Clarence and all. It was only polite to ask." She looked at her hands, stained with dirt and scratches. "Remember when you all said my family was mean?" "How could I forget? I'm so sorry, and you know I didn't mean you. You're so nice." She sniffled again. "I know, silly, but y'all is right. My daddy sure is mean. He was yelling at me today, and Jake told him to stop, but Daddy doesn't like to be told what to do." "Is your brother okay?" She nodded her head up and down, but didn't stop crying. "But sometimes I don't like my daddy very much, and I know it don't seem right, but it's true." Didn't that beat all? After I'd spent all day thinking about how mad I was at my daddy, Pam started telling me more about how upset she was with hers. Through her tears, she used words like "smacks us" and yells at Mom or Jake when they try to stop him. But by the time she was done telling about her daddy, we sure could have used Miss Millie's hanky. Instead, Pam had to use the bottom of her shirt, and we both laughed at that. After Eddie came back to play with Pam, I sat for a while by myself and had me a revelation. Like another closed window in my brain was cracked open with a new information again. Maybe, just maybe, having no daddy was better than having a mean daddy. My heart started spinning from all the new thoughts cramming into it. I was confused, and I knew where I needed to be. "Do you think Clarence is okay to walk?" I asked a surprised Miss Millie as I stood at her back door. We decided to let his hind leg rest and not walk him that day, but I really needed the company now, and Clarence was standing next to her looking fine. "Well, he's doing much better today, wants to be up and moving even though he limps a bit. I bet it would do him good to get out for a stretch." We were almost to the church before Miss Millie asked, "Do you want to talk about it?" I shrugged. She whistled through her teeth. Well, if you drag your feet anymore, I think people will think you're older than I am. And she chuckled just enough to start a coughing fit. I walked on without saying anything. That's fine, she offered. Sometimes we just need to be alone in our thoughts. And she looked at me again. But sometimes we just need to remember we're not alone. We walked a few more steps before I finally spoke. My birthday's next month. She whistled again. Well, goodness! I sure understand why you're so upset about that. What with you being so very old and all. I rolled my eyes. It's not that. It's just that with what happened yesterday, I don't think Daddy will even remember. Miss Millie nodded. You afraid he'll forget your birthday? Or are you afraid he'll forget you? And that's when my own tears started. Both. Miss Millie stopped walking and put her arm around me. Clarence walked until his leash tightened and he jerked his head a little with the tug of it. He looked back at us and before I knew it, he was nudging his head on my hand like he wanted me to pet him all of a sudden. And that made me snort through my tears. Miss Millie took out a new hanky and wiped my eyes. I promise you, Alice girl, your daddy is the one missing out the most by not knowing the real you. Before I could answer, I saw a lady I recognized from the church choir walking out of church heading our way. And I thought it might be the one who Miss Millie said gossiped about her, but I wasn't certain. Until I heard the two ladies together. Millie! The lady held her name for a pretty near 10 seconds, saying it as sweet as one could. Miss Millie wasn't participating in the sweetness. She said the lady's name like she was taking attendance. Miss Mary. Miss Mary continued being her overly friendly self, and this precious child must be Loretta's granddaughter. I heard you two were becoming quite the twosome. 2 peas in a pod, I hear. This here's Alice. Alice, this here is Miss Mary, the one I was telling you about who sings in the church. I tried not to laugh out loud as Miss Millie's message to me, and Miss Mary didn't even seem to notice there wasn't even a compliment in there for her. Oh, that's so nice of you. I do my best for him. She paused and looked up at the sky. Miss Millie turned to start walking again, but Miss Mary stopped her. Actually, I'm glad you mentioned that. I've been meaning to tell you I was speaking to the preacher about your funeral. Miss Millie nodded her head. I bet you were. And Miss Mary smiled an overly big smile. Well, I heard you in there the other day discussing it with him, so I told him it'd be my pleasure to sing when the day comes. Miss Millie tipped her head back and looked down her nose at Miss Mary. Well, aren't you just a little singing vulture waiting for me to die? Oh, no, of course not, Miss Mary pretended to be shocked. I certainly hope it's not for a long time, but no, when it happens, I'll be there. That's what keeps me living, Miss Millie mumbled as she walked away. I glanced at Miss Mary, who no longer pretended to smile. We walked a few more steps before I had to ask, are you dying? Alice girl, we are all dying. We walked on. You know what I mean. Yes. Yes, you know what I mean, or yes, you're dying. Without missing a beat, she answered, both. And that's the end of chapter 22. Now, this book is filled with figurative language, and figurative language is like when it says something, but it doesn't actually mean that. So one of the phrases in this chapter was that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. And that phrase doesn't mean that an apple falls off a tree close by. It means that, and you've probably heard your parents say this, but when they say, oh, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, when I think about like my boys and they say something like Mr. Smith would say, I say, oh, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. It means that the fruit or the child is a lot like their father. So they use this phrase when they're talking about the McHales. And the McHales, Miss Millie refers to the apple not falling far from the tree. She's talking about the McHale children and them being like their father. And as we have learned about the McHales, we have the older McHale boy. We have Pam. And then we have the boy who found, oh, I just forgot his name. I'm so sorry. Jake. So we have Pam and Jake, and I guess you would argue that Pam and Jake are not apples that are like their father, where the oldest McHale boy kind of is. So figurative language is throughout this book. In the early chapters, it was like every other page there was some kind of figurative language. So I want you to kind of think about that today. I want you to think about how an apple doesn't fall far from the tree. And when we use that language, how does that relate to the McHale boys? So I want you to think about the oldest McHale boy, who is not very kind. And then you have Jake and Pam, who are both very kind. And then I think that's all I want you to reflect on today. As you can see, we do not have much to go, but there is like 8 chapters in this little part of the book. So there's not going to be a lot, but there a lot of reading, but there is a really, really lot that's going to happen in the book yet. So thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for being responsible and doing the work. I want you to know how much I miss you, and I hope you guys have a wonderful day today. Okay, talk to you tomorrow.